Throughout history, freethinkers have outraged the religious with their wacky ideas about the virtues of free speech, reason, and of course, eating babies. Now, God is dying, and it's time to dispose of his remains. From the pits of hell, Satan sends two puppets of the imperialist West and the Zionist Jews against God, Islam, and tiny kittens to bring you their propaganda and conspire for a new world order. This is Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment with Ali Rizvi and Armin Navabi.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. My name is Ali Rizvi, and with me is Armin Navabi. Armin, hi, how are you?
Hello.
So I'll just get to it. We are here today with Tom Holland. And Tom Holland, as many of our audience members know, is a historian and the author of several best-selling books, including In the Shadow of the Sword, which charted the origins and the early history of Islam based on recent scholarship. He also had a documentary, Islam, The Untold Story, which I know many of you have watched, which was very eye-opening and also controversial, and it made Tom the target of numerous death threats, which would come as no surprise to many of us. And then he also has another documentary called ISIS, The Origins of Violence. So, Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Really Thank you very much for having me on. Thanks very much.
So I wanted to just start at the beginning before we get into this. So much we want to get into, so we're going to try to fight for your time as much as we can. But just as a beginning, can you just go through a little bit of how you became interested in history and how specifically you were led to Islamic history?
Well, I got interested in history as a very young child, and it was a kind of logical progression from my boyhood obsession with dinosaurs. I was just one of those boys obsessed by them, and they're big, they're fierce, they're extinct, and I seamlessly moved on to ancient empires because they're basically the historical equivalent, something like the Romans. I mean, they're like the tyrannosaurs of history, fierce, predatory, glamorous, and long gone, and so. The focus of my kind of historical interest was always the civilizations of the Near East, so Babylon, Assyria, Persia in particular, and the classical Mediterranean, so Greece and then Rome. And my first book was on the fall of the Roman Republic, so that's the time of Julius Caesar and Cicero, and then I wrote a book on the Persian invasions of Greece, so that's Thermopylae and Salamis and all that kind of thing. And I became kind of inhabiting the minds of the people like Leonidas, who died at Thermopylae, Julius Caesar, who conquered Gaul. I began to feel how alien they were, how kind of frightening. And I became interested really in explaining what explained the kind of seeming chasm between me and my world and the way that almost everybody I knew thought, and the way that these kind of saurian creatures in the past inhabited. And I came to the conclusion that it was the process that gave birth to what you might call monotheism, so Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And I wrote a book about essentially how Latin Christendom emerged out of late antiquity. And then, of course, in the course of writing that, I couldn't help but think about, where did Islam come from? And I was kind of nervous about approaching it because it wasn't really a world that I knew very much about. My knowledge of Islam basically stopped with the Arabian Nights. I was obsessed by Sinbad and all that kind of thing, but I was aware that this wasn't entirely a kind of way into the complexities of early Islamic history. But one thing that particularly kind of grabbed me was contemplating a monument in Ravenna in North Italy, it's the mausoleum of a Gothic king who ruled after what we think of as the end of the Western Roman Empire, when the last Roman emperor was deposed. But in fact, Rome didn't end then. It carried on. There continued to be chariot races in the Circus Maximus. The consuls continued to be elected. The Senate continued to sit. It's just that it was ruled by this barbarian king. And Theodoric ruled very much like a Caesar. But he also wanted to distinguish himself from the Romans. So he would show himself on his coins with a moustache, for instance, and moustaches were regarded as something so barbaric that there was no word in it for Latin. Latin didn't have a word for it at all.
You're talking about the mustache.
The moustache. So just the moustache on the same. They had a beard and a moustache, but they didn't have just a moustache. I mean, how revolting, how barbarian was that? So it was a way for Theodoric to show, he'd wear the cloak of a Caesar, but he'd have the moustache of a Goth. And likewise, although he ruled as a Christian, he ruled as an Arian Christian rather than as a Catholic Christian. So he was ruling. He was a heretic in the minds of most of his Roman subjects. And his mausoleum is simultaneously, there are kind of echoes of barbarian traditions, but it's also consciously drawing on Roman architectural traditions. And if you look at it, it's got a kind of dome, and there's just the faintest hint of the Dome of the Rock. It's got octagonal sides and things like that. And so I started thinking, well, was this what was happening in the early decades of the Arab rule of what had been the Roman Empire? Is the Dome of the Rock basically the kind of Archaeopteryx of architecture? Is it a kind of midway point between theropod dinosaurs and birds? Is it the kind of evolutionary missing link? So is it an example of how Islam kind of evolves from the great empires of antiquity, not just the Roman, but the Persian empires as well, which were toppled. So that was essentially what I thought I wanted to do, because there are lots of books about the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, about how Britain and Gaul and Spain and Italy, kind of the Roman Empire ended there and barbarian kingdoms emerged, but very few on the similar process that must have happened in the Near East. And by and large, what you get when you look at history books on the Near East is books that are interested in the Persian or the Roman Empire stop, clunk, at the beginning of the 7th century, and it's like a guillotine dropping on the neck of the kind of history. And then if you want to look at books on early Islam, they begin with Muhammad. And it's as though there's an absolute firewall between the two periods. It's as though the ancient history ends, the Roman period ends, and clunk, the medieval period begins, the Islamic period begins. But obviously, it doesn't work like that. I mean, periods of history don't change like you're flicking a switch or something like that. It's much, much more complicated than that. And so that's why the Dome of the Rock was so interesting to me, because it's a physical symbol of this process by which something recognizably Islamic emerges out of what are clearly Roman traditions. And so that was what I then became interested in. So started reading, immersing myself in the sources for early Islam. And what immediately struck me was that there was pretty much nothing in the earliest Islamic sources that showed any awareness of the world into which Islam must have been born. So Romans, Persians, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians are basically cardboard cutout characters. There is no consciousness, no real sense at all of the world that the early Arabs must have conquered. And reflecting on why that was, of course, it struck me that these are all very late, that really you don't get accounts of the Prophet's life, accounts of how the Quran came to be revealed, accounts of how the Arabs conquered the Near East until about AD 800. So that's almost 2 centuries after the lifetime of Muhammad. And historiographically, when you're talking about the emergence of an empire, and particularly when you're talking about the emergence of what I guess we should probably call religious traditions, 200 years is an enormously long time, because what both empires do and what religious traditions do is to back project. So essentially everything it's like the concrete is sticky, it's plastic, you can shape it, but then after a time it freezes. And essentially, the account that we have of the emergence of the Arab Empire and the emergence of Islam reflects the point at which the concrete set. But the challenge of going back and working out, well, what was it like when it was still spewing out of the concrete mixer? That's really difficult. And that's why it was by far the hardest book that I have ever written.
To put things in perspective, for a lot of our audience already know this, but really quickly, just to give some idea what you're talking about. Muhammad allegedly lived from 570 to 632. Then we had the Rashidun, which was, and then we had the Umayyad dynasty from 661 to 750, and then we had the Abbasid dynasty. But given that Muhammad died in 632, the earliest writings about his life and who he was and what we did, the earliest one we have, I think, is from Ibn Hisham at 833, which he kind of sourced it to some earlier sources from Ibn Ishaq from 765, but none of the 765 ones are around. The earliest one is 833, which is around 200 years after the alleged death of Muhammad, which, if you compare it to Christianity, we have a lot of skepticism with Christianity, but even with Christianity, it's about 15 to 60 years after alleged death of Jesus. With Islam, it's 200 years, which is a lot longer. I mean,
if you compare it with Christianity, we have Paul's letters, which are written 15, 20 years after the probable date of the crucifixion. And then you have the four canonical Gospels, which, as you say, probably something like 60 years after Jesus' death. Yeah. And the reason that they're canonical is that they're the earliest, basically. That's the reason.
Right.
And then you have people writing Gospels 200 years after Jesus' death, but they're completely mad. I mean, they're all kind of mad Gnostic stuff, weird spirits and all kinds of mad stuff that no historian would look at these Gnostic Gospels and say these are fascinating. This gives us clear evidence for the life of Jesus, the historical Jesus, and this gives us clear evidence for what life was like in early first century AD Judea. That is clearly not what the writers of these Gnostic Gospels are interested in. These writers are interested in giving their take on who Jesus was, and why basically they are right and all the other people who are writing Gospels are wrong. That's essentially what it's about. Their prime interest, it doesn't mean that they're fakes, it doesn't mean that they're frauds, it just means that they have an understanding of who Jesus is, and like a preacher, they want to give the best possible understanding of it to those who they want to bring round to their cause. And essentially, that's what anyone writing at a distance is doing, and that's what the earliest writers of the surviving biographies of Muhammad are doing. Now, what is their interest? We can kind of tell that because although we don't have accounts written by believing Muslims, we have kind of scattered evidence from, intriguingly, it almost seems, from the lifetime of Muhammad himself. So you're right that the traditional date for his death is 632, but we have a document written in 634 which describes a prophet of the Saracens leading an invasion of Palestine.
634.
And it's fairly clear that this prophet of the Saracens kind of is Muhammad. It's a text that's kind of at the heart of Hagarism, the notorious book by Michael Cook and Patricia Kroner, which kind of kicked off the whole process of looking at Islam, the origins of Islam in a revisionist way. But it's very interesting because it does seem to suggest that there are various traditions associated with an Arab, specifically Arab prophet, and that the focus of this Arab prophet is what Christians call the Holy Land, what Jews would call Israel, what's now Palestine and Israel, and that this is the main focus. And even in the late sources, it seems clear that the initial object of the Arab invasions, the Arab conquests, however you want to call them, is the Holy Land.
Right.
And why would that be? Well, it's clear that the matrix from which this prophet of the Saracens is emerging is essentially a biblical one. It's one in which his legitimacy seems to be derived from the fact that he, as an Arab, is descended from Abraham, from Ibrahim, as he will be called in the Muslim tradition.
From Hagar.
And yeah, and so Abraham has two sons. One, Isaac, is the ancestor of the Jews. One, Ishmael. By the time of the 7th century, it had been absolutely established by Jewish and Christian commentators that the heirs of Ishmael were the Arabs. So the Arabs, uniquely among all the barbarians who fringed the Roman Empire, were a biblical people. They had a biblical status. So all the other people, the Franks, the Goths, the Angles, whoever, when they get converted, they have to adopt the role of the Jews, of the children of Israel, as a chosen people. So in Britain, when Bede writes his account of the Anglo-Saxons coming to Britain, he's casting them as Israelites. He's casting them as people being led by Moses across water, so equivalent of the Red Sea, into a promised land. And you get this thing of barbarian peoples as Israelites, as children of Israel, again and again and again. But uniquely, what the Arabs could do is to say, well, we're not the children of Israel, we're the children of Ishmael. And that gives us a blood right to the land. That gives us a blood right. And so that seems to be what lies behind this account. And it's telling that this account that's written in 634 is put into the mouth of a Jew. And the Jews are kind of uncertain whether to welcome this or whether to be anxious about this. Now, by what process would a prophet who is described as being alive in 634, why, by the time you get to 800 AD, why would they think that he'd been dead by then? Why are they saying, well, he dies in 632 before the invasions begin? Well, there is an obvious biblical parallel to what is going on. And again, it's Moses. And Moses is the key figure here, because Moses is the prophet who is most mentioned in the Quran. He leads an exodus. And that essentially is what Muhammad is famous for. Hijrah is an exodus supposedly from Mecca to Medina. But it's and so this idea of leading an exodus seems to be part of the tradition right from the beginning. But what happens to Moses? Does Moses lead the invasion of Canaan, of the promised land in the Bible? No, he doesn't. He dies before the Israelites cross the Jordan and famously capture Jericho by blowing the trumpets, and the walls come down, and no one knows where he's buried. And so Muhammad is clearly being modeled on Moses. And so you can see how over the course of time it becomes incumbent on people looking to him as the greatest of the prophets. If they're going to model him on Moses, he cannot play the role of Joshua as well. He has to die before the Arabs enter the promised land. And of course, in time, the role that the promised land plays in this kind of proto-Islam gets buried because the Arabs end up conquering an empire that's vastly greater than the promised land. And so that whole early tradition gets buried. But what you still have is this kind of fossilized memory of it, the process by which Muhammad has ceased to be he can't be a conqueror. He has to die before they enter. And essentially, the whole biography of Muhammad, as it comes to be preserved and handed down, it doesn't reflect memories of the historical Muhammad. I mean, it may to a degree, and it's very difficult to know quite how much. But what it clearly does reflect is a desire to cast Muhammad as someone who is modeled on the example of the biblical prophets, and above all on Moses, because Moses is a guy who leads his people into a promised land, and that's what is happening with the Arab conquest.
Just to be clear,
Armin, just one question. So in all of this, so as Armin mentioned, like the collections of the actual written down accounts come centuries after, but the Quran and the Constitution of Medina, people say, have been dated historically to the lifetime of the Prophet. So can you, or of Muhammad? So can you comment on that?
Okay, so the nightmare with writing a history of this is essentially that that we only have one account of how the Quran came into being, of the life of Muhammad, of the beginnings of Islam, of the process by which the conquests happened. And that is the Islamic one that we get from, say, the 9th Christian century onwards. Mm. There is no other account.
But what about the dating of the parchments?
Right. Okay. So you're then so if you want to somehow delve beneath that, you essentially have to rely on evidence from Jewish or Christian or Zoroastrian accounts that are nearly contemporaneous. But obviously you can't rely on them being authentic either, because they're all party pre. They all have their own perspectives, their own drums to beat. And why would they particularly understand or take a particular interest in what's going on? I mean, these are just a bunch of hairy heretics who are coming in. What else can you do? Well, there's carbon dating, but the carbon dating is highly contested. It's very difficult. A lot of the carbon dating actually is dating the earliest Qurans to the 6th century, so even before Muhammad. I mean, what the hell do you do with that? So ultimately, when you're trying to look for solid ground, I think the best way to do it is to look at the world, the context, the matrix from which Islam emerges, and essentially try and work out what elements within that are clearly dating from say the early 7th century. What are dating from earlier periods, and to what extent, therefore, are there elements within canonical Islamic sources, the Quran above all, that would point to a date? And the Quran is obviously the foundational text, because the Quran is the foundation for everything that Muslims believe about Muhammad. I mean, that without the Quran there is no Islam. So, and it's a text. It's a massive, great text. It's not like the body of Jesus. There is no body of Jesus to look at, so we can't know. But with the Quran, you have the text. You have this supposed intrusion of the divine. So essentially, as a historian, you have to ask yourself, is the Quran so miraculous? Is it so unexpected that the only explanation for it is that it comes from God? Or are there elements within it that seem to come from a particular cultural and historical context? And essentially, it seems to me clear that it's the latter. I mean, the Quran is a highly late antique text. It's a highly distinctive one. But it fuses, like a kind of great carpet, it fuses different threads that when you break them down are clearly analyzable. And there are in particular, there are elements that seem to me to point to it originating in the period that tradition ascribes to it, the lifetime of Muhammad. Because what you have in the lifetime of Muhammad essentially is a process of civilizational breakdown without parallel, really, since the age of the Sea Peoples, which saw the destruction of the Bronze Age kingdoms, kind of almost 2,000 years before. And essentially what has happened is that the established superpowers of the age, the Roman and the Persian empires, have been buffeted by a series of unprecedented catastrophes, the worst of which probably is an outbreak of bubonic plague in the 540s, which probably is more lethal than the Black Death, which wiped out something like a third of the population of Europe in the 14th century. So this is death killing on a devastating scale. It doesn't just kill people, it wipes out the tax base for these highly bureaucratic empires. It wipes out available sources of manpower. Where are you going to recruit people to man your frontiers? Well, you're going to get them from people who are not affected by it, and that's basically people who live in the desert. So essentially, for the first time really since the dawn of civilization, you have almost a parity between people who are living in the kind of desert fringes and people who are living in the urbanized
because
areas.
People in the desert were immune from people in the desert were kind of immune from the disease because they were living in cities, right?
Yeah, essentially.
So yeah, go on. Sorry.
So and then at the beginning of the 7th century, you've had the kind of the antiquities version of the Black Death. the beginning of the 7th century, you have its equivalent of the First World War, when the Persian and the Roman empires absolutely smashed the shit out of each other. And at one point, the Persians have occupied Syria, they've occupied Palestine, so that means they've occupied Jerusalem, they've captured the True Cross, which is the great emblem of the Roman Empire. They even annexed Egypt. They marched all the way up to the shores of the Bosphorus, so they almost reached the walls of Constantinople itself. And that means that you have the Arabs who've been employed as mercenaries on the frontier of Palestine, of Syria. They lose their paymasters, and also they're witnessing the seeming implosion of everything that had seemed solid. So it's as though China and America were suddenly just to implode. You've just taken for granted. You always take for granted they're going to be there. But what if China just completely, crashes
at the same time?
And you've got a plague going on, and you've got climate change, and you've got, precipitous drop in temperatures.
And
you're in an age when everything is assumed to happen because it's the will of God. So you've got Christian monks, you've got rabbis, you've got Zoroastrian priests, all looking to try and understand what the hell is going on. And I think out in the desert fringes around Palestine, the desert fringes where the tradition associates with Abraham, the father of Isaac, but also the father of Ishmael, I think that's what Muhammad is doing. And I think that there are clear trace elements within the Quran of this specific period. So there's a verse that mentions the Romans. Right. It's the only verse in the whole of the Quran that name checks a kind of geopolitical entity by name, and it describes the Romans suffering a defeat, but they will then come back from defeat, and that's basically what happens. Right. You also have accounts of empires being like kind of grains of sand on a wind, being like chaff just blown away. And again, this is a perspective on great power politics that is absolutely in accord with the age. And you have it's a massively apocalyptic text. It's particularly in the later sections of it. It's a text that takes for granted the awesome and total power of God over the affairs of man, and that he can just roll up the whole of creation like a scroll, and that everything can be brought to an end. His power is absolute and total. And this, you can imagine this text emerging from the convulsions of the age. That said, it's also clear that there are elements within the Quran that are much older than that reach back to, there are elements of Gnostic Gospels, there are elements of rabbinical traditions, there are kind of trace elements, almost, it seems, of fragments that were in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's like a kind of a vast lake into which all kinds of streams have been pouring and have been mixing, and some are quite recent, some are much older, but these waters have blurred and blended together to create this astonishing text that provides a kind of assurance, clear, and it's clear that this assurance is there right from the beginning, that the person who's articulated it is indeed a prophet, that these are indeed the authentic pronouncements of God. And if you're looking for something that is genuinely mysterious about the beginnings of Islam, and that really, I think, defies the efforts of any historian to explain it, it is this sense that seems manifest from the beginning that the Quran, as a text that's been revealed to a prophet, and we presume this prophet is Muhammad, is authentically coming from the divine. It's authentically heavenly. And that is there right from the beginning, I think. And that seems to me the radioactive heart of what will become Islam. It's just that the form, the kind of, if you like, the power station that will be built over this radioactive heart takes many, many decades, many centuries, and probably doesn't approximate to what was there at the beginning.
So just to point out the significance of what you're saying for those who might have missed it, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, all right? But basically the implication seems to be that, unlike what most people understand about the history of Islam, that it was some people, some Arabs in the desert, they started a religion called Islam, and then they went to become an empire using that religion. That story is completely the other way around. It was a group of people, it was these Arabs first became an empire, without being Muslim, without having a religion called Islam. They went to Jerusalem, they captured these places, they were still just Arabs, they were not Muslims, and then they invented this religion called Islam after they became an empire. Is that done?
I wouldn't want to say invented, because that makes it sound like they all got together and concocted it, like a massive fraud or something. It wasn't like that. It was a much more complicated process.
Right.
But yes, it emerges over the course of the decades.
Right.
And it's kind of okay. So another metaphor. It's like the seedbed. The seedbed is the world of late antiquity. It's the great empires of Persia and Rome. It's the great religious traditions of Christianity, of Judaism, of Zoroastrianism. It's also almost, presumably Arab traditions, native traditions. This is the seedbed. The Quran is the first shoot. It's the first offshoot of it. It gets watered by the astonishing fact that the Arabs, who previously had been at best employed as mercenaries by the great powers, and at worst had been despised as kind of nomadic savages, end up ruling these provinces, end up ruling the kind of, they seize the heartlands of the Roman and the Persian empires. And this is such a miraculous achievement that it requires an explanation. And more than that, it requires an explanation that does not subordinate this emergent empire to the traditions of Persia, which has been demolished utterly, and more saliently to the traditions of the Second Rome of Constantinople, because that remains as the great rival. So the option that is open, say, to Theodoric in Italy, to be a Christian, but a variant Christian, that may be something that the early Umayyads take on. It may be that Muawiyah is a kind of Christian. We're told that he goes on pilgrimage to the holy sites in Jerusalem, the Christian sites in Jerusalem. I mean, he seems to be a kind of Christian. But his son, Abdul Malik, very clearly, and we have enough, he's the guy who builds the Dome of the Rock. He mints coins that enable us to work out what the message is. And his message is absolutely that he's not a Christian. And this is a way of Abdul Malik saying, I'm not a Caesar, I'm better than a Caesar, I'm not a Christian, Christianity's been trumped, I'm not a Jew, Judaism has been put in its place. So what is the replacement? And it's under Abdul Malik that you start getting top-down references to a figure called Muhammad, who's recognizably the prophet who gives the Quran. But Abdul Malik is basically casting himself as at least the equal of Muhammad. So Abdul Malik is casting himself as a kind of messianic figure. Well, so Abdul Malik is he's St. Paul and Constantine rolled into one and then squared. But in due course, when the claims of the caliphs, the kind of imperial leaders of what becomes Islam, get contested by scholars, by lawyers who are clearly influenced by the rabbinical tradition, an understanding of law as something that has been revealed to a prophet, but then also has been handed down through the generations to scholars. And these scholars then start to make an Islam that ultimately will threaten the caliphate with total redundancy. So in due course, many centuries down the line, when the caliphate gets abolished totally, Islam can kind of shrug it off.
So it was a power play between the scholars and the caliphs.
Absolutely,
right.
and it's what serves to overthrow the Umayyad dynasty, and the Umayyads then get cast, rather than being basically the founders, the creators of Islam, the Umayyads get cast as a kind of deviant aberration, and instead what you get is this idea that Islam was revealed to Muhammad in its entirety. So you had everything. You had not just the Quran, but you had all the sayings of Muhammad that would enable lawyers to draw up the law, to draw up the constitutions, to draw up the sense of how a properly organized Islamic state should function. It was all there, given by God on a plate to Muhammad. Muhammad had then revealed it all to the Muslim people. Islam was absolutely ready to go. It was completely constructed. They then conquer the world. The fact that they're able to do this proves that God is favoring them. Then you get the Umayyads in. They cock it all up because they like monkeys, and they do have bards and all kinds of appalling things. And they kill God's prophets and all that kind of stuff. And then they get overthrown because God's angry with them. And you get the Abbasids come in, and they're a bit better. But basically, you still have the lawyers, the scholars who are busy constructing a legally based kind of understanding of how society should be organized. That, in the essence, that is the essence of Sunni Islam. It's a legally based.
So I want to clarify, because when I said invented, you compared it to evolution, dinosaurs. Just like evolution looks purposeful and it isn't. That's why we use the word invented, because it looks purposeful, but it's just like evolution of the memes, right?
But I mean the parallel is obviously, we're talking a kind of biblically, scripturally based tradition, and the Muslims in over the course of the 8th and 9th century, who are recalibrating their religious tradition to demonstrate that everything had culminated in the kind of Islam that they are in the process of fashioning, are doing nothing that the church fathers and the rabbis hadn't also done. So the church fathers are looking back at the inheritance of Jewish scripture and reconfiguring it so that it demonstrates the truths of Christianity. And the rabbis are likewise reconfiguring it to demonstrate that it all, that the prophets basically were the equivalent of rabbis. So they're doing the same thing. But also, if you look at every other ancient empire, they do exactly the same thing too.
Right.
So in the reign of Augustus Caesar, that is when Virgil is writing the Aeneid, and it gives us the account of how the Roman Empire came into existence. Livy is writing the early history of Rome, giving us the story of Romulus and Remus and all the early kings. These are not telling us what actually happened when Rome was founded. What it's telling us is what people in the reign of Augustus thought had happened, and it's holding a mirror up. The past is a mirror that's being held up to the apogee of Roman power. And essentially, it's exactly the same, that the empire of the Arabs has kind of emerged in this ad hoc, unexpected way. And an empire on this vast, unprecedented scale has to express the will of God. It has to serve a purpose. So there has to be a teleology. There has to be a kind of sense that this is all serving a particular end. And so in Baghdad, which has become the greatest capital on the face of the planet, this is what the scholars set to doing. Exactly the way that Virgil and Livy had constructed a backstory for the rise of Rome, so they construct a backstory for the rise of the Arab Empire. And it's and this is a tradition that goes back even before Rome. I mean, basically, Baghdad is on the, it's just up from Babylon, and Babylon is just up from Earth. This is a process that goes all the way back to the very beginnings of urban civilization. Yeah. What is distinctive about the Arab Empire, though, is that it privileges the desert over the city. So even though Umayyad and Abbasid civilization is highly urban, be it based in Damascus or in Baghdad, legitimacy is adduced from the desert. So essentially what the Muslim lawyers do when they are cannibalizing the legal systems and the traditions of the conquered peoples, so be it rabbinical or Roman or Persian or Zoroastrian or whatever, they can't say, well, this is where it comes from, in the way that say the barbarians in the West can just absorb Roman law and say it's Roman. They can't. The Arabs can't do that because they're claiming that they've received everything from a prophet. So they have to take these traditions and ascribe them to a prophet. Now, how do you know that these traditions are genuinely coming from a prophet and not just being picked up? Well, if the prophet comes from the middle of a desert that's, hundreds and hundreds of miles from the center of urban civilization, then that must prove it. So essentially, in exactly the same way as Christians, if they want to prove that Jesus is the Son of God and not the son of some centurion, as the rabbis like to say, they have to say that Mary was a virgin, because if Mary's not a virgin, then Jesus could be anybody's son. I mean, why would you think he's the Son of God? Likewise, if Muhammad is a prophet, he has to have his revelations absolutely in the middle of nowhere. So what Mary's virgin womb is to Christians, the deserts that surround Mecca become to Muslims. It's the proof that the foundations of their faith are divine.
Is it not also
sorry, Armin? I gotta move just to the because now you're talking about the moving.
No, that's what I was going to ask about, because is one reason that they might have thrown it they changed their history and they threw Mecca in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of desert. Could one reason for that be that it's also beyond reach for people to prove that these stories didn't come from there? Like it kind of like throwing it far away where nobody had access to for many years? Or
actually, Tom, just to add on to that, could you, as you answer Armin's question, could you also sort of talk, because you mentioned Abdul Malik, and Abdul Malik is largely based on what I read, is that he's the reason that Mecca ended up in the Hijaz. So if you could sort of connect that. Okay,
that's the best sense that I can make of it. I mean, I need to emphasize that there is no certainty here whatsoever. We simply don't know. There is no mention of, and when I say Mecca, I mean Mecca as it is now, right. the center of the Hajj, the place in Saudi Arabia. There is no mention of this place in any text, basically, that precedes the Quran. Mecca is described, there's one mention of it in the Quran, but it's unclear what it is, unclear whether it's a town or a valley or whatever. The earliest mention of it in a datable text is, I think, 740, and then it's located in the deserts of Iraq. And it's only, again, our familiar kind of bottleneck of the beginning of the 9th Christian century, that we start to clearly get a sense of Mecca as being in the place where it is now. So therefore, the question is, well, was Mecca, or at least was the kind of the shrine of the Ishmaelites, was it always in Mecca, or was it somewhere else? And I think that there is enough evidence within the Quran, which essentially is the only definite primary source we have, to suggest that it probably wasn't. So there's the famous details that Patricia Kroner adduced that supposedly the region has vines and has olives, and this is clearly impossible, and yes, and that it's a kind of agricultural region, and this doesn't seem to correspond to what's now Mecca at all. But the other I think really killing detail is that the mushrikun, the associators, the people who basically the prophet and or God is arguing with throughout the fabric of the Quran, are not the pagans that you get in the traditional Muslim account. They're clearly biblically knowledgeable. They're monotheistic, and essentially what is going on in the Quran, it seems to be an argument about the proper status of angels and the proper way that agricultural rituals should be organized. And this obviously doesn't correspond to the received tradition at all. I mentioned before the importance of both Moses and of Abraham, and the traditions that are associated with both those prophets are those of the deserts that lie beyond Palestine. So into what we now call the Sinai, up around Petra, and then east into Jordan. So it seems to me much likelier that is the region where the kind of the sacral center of emergent Islam is. By what process does it? Why does it change? Why does it get lost? Well, Abdul Malik comes to power in a kind of violent war for control of the Arab Empire with another Arab leader who seems to have based himself in this religious center, and Abdul Malik seems to have obliterated it. I mean, we're told in the sources that he obliterates it and then he rebuilds it. Yeah, and then he rebuilds it. So you've got this process of something being destroyed and then being rebuilt, and this is something very, very, very common in this period. I mean, there's an amazing account of Zoroastrians going to worship in a fire temple that supposedly was founded at the beginning of time, but which we know from the archaeology, it was built 100 years before. It's being described as being timeless. And you look at the Holy Land, all the sites where the sites that are associated with biblical prophets or with the apostles, these are made up in the 4th century when people start going there and saying, well, this must be that, this must be that, this must be that. And of course, the person who takes the lead in that is Helena, Constantine's mother, when she finds that supposedly the true cross, and I finds the place where supposedly that the tomb of Christ and Golgotha and everything. I mean, it's all made up. But to this day, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre holds, it bears witness to this kind of process. And someone who is as powerful as Abdul Malik, who is as convinced of his own righteousness, it seems entirely possible that having destroyed a site that he would then say was heretically associated with his rival, who's been found wanting, in the balance by God and cast out. I assume there must be something at what's now Mecca that was associated with Muhammad. I mean, there must be something there that would have made it. Presumably, there was a Kaaba of some kind. I mean, Kaaba's cubes are, again, they're quite common across northern Arabia. So presumably there was something there. Maybe there was some tradition that was associated with Muhammad. I mean, we just don't know. We cannot know. So but that seems to me the likeliest explanation. And it's not just me. There are several scholars who think this.
Dan, one of the there's patron questions, a lot of them on this. Right. So I just want to throw this out there. Really quickly.
And I will add on to that question then after.
Yeah, okay. You can add on to that. Sorry, we're fighting for your time here. So Dan Gibson is a sort of a self-styled scholar who made a really impressive documentary a couple of years ago called The Sacred City, in which he went out and made the case that Petra, Jordan, was the actual original Mecca. Right. So he built the case. He used a lot of the same things that you're saying. A lot of the things that other scholars have unearthed before too, the evidence with whether it's the archaeology or the history of the soil there, or just the wars where people are going back from Mecca to Damascus, then they're coming back to Mecca to fight the war, and they're doing it within 40 days, which is impossible. So he really dissected it, and it was fairly controversial, as was your claim. So could you comment on that about Petra being a candidate?
On Petra.
Oh, and Armin, sorry.
Yeah, but let me just add on to that, because a lot of people, we have some people that completely understand what we're talking about, but just for our newcomers and also to add on to that question, the understanding basically is that this whole Muhammad story started, just in case you missed the significance of this, the story of Muhammad did not start in Mecca. It was late. All the stories, as we discussed, changed later to fit certain narratives, certain political needs, because of the civil war that was happening in the Islamic community at that time. People were competing for different stories, and the understanding is that this Mecca was not in the Hejaz; it was somewhere else. And some scholars, like Dave Gibson, are suggesting that it was Petra, not Mecca, and then it was later moved. And this Zubair Guard, the competition between the Umayyad Khalif Malik and Zubair was key in why this was moved. Right. So
well, as I said, I don't think that there is enough evidence to say it was Petra, or it was this place, or it was that place. I just don't think there is enough evidence. And to be honest, I mean, the evidence that I've been adducing, it's my best case, but I freely admit that you can you can twist the Rubik's cube in a number of different ways, and once you abandon the traditional Muslim account, essentially there are as many different theories as to what might have happened as there are scholars. And again, a parallel might be, well, where is Camelot? Camelot is such a significant feature in the stories of King Arthur, but the moment you start saying, well, where was the real Camelot, it's opening a can of worms. The evidence is much, I don't think King Arthur even existed. So, but the evidence is better for Muhammad. But it's still, there are huge problems with constructing a definite case. So that said, what's the case for Petra? Well, we know that goddesses who are mentioned in the Quran were worshipped there. We know that, you just have to walk down to Petra and there are cubes everywhere. So there's that. There are verses in the Quran that describe cities being carved out of mountains. So again, that might seem to hint at it. There is a significant topographical pointer where it talks about the people of Lot. And people passing them day and night. I mean, Petra isn't actually that close to where, this is a reference to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which in late antiquity were located, as they are to this day, were located at the very bottom tip of the Dead Sea. I mean, it's Petra's quite close to it, but not maybe quite close enough. But it's possible to imagine that Muhammad is speaking to a community for whom Petra is the closest large town,
right.
And that therefore Petra becomes the embodiment of arrogance, of wealth, of empires. Because what you do get in the Quran a lot is an insistence on how people have fashioned cities out of mountainsides, and also how they have made the desert bloom. And what we know is that the deserts around Sinai, southern Israel, so the Negev, into Jordan, that in the 6th century, when Roman power was still functioning, the feats of irrigation were absolutely astonishing, and regions were urbanized that up until that point had never been urbanized and are still not urbanized now. And presumably over the course of the Great Wars in the early 7th century, these then came to be abandoned. So these would have served as kind of spectacles of the poverty of human accomplishments, particularly when set against the might and the power and the destructiveness of the divine. So you could see that kind of providing a context for the kind of apocalyptic imagery that you get within the Quran. So I think it's entirely possible that it was Petra. I know I've spoken to a very great scholar who thought that it was Petra. It seems an entirely plausible explanation, plausible thesis. But I think that the matrix is likely to be an agricultural community beyond Petra, and my suspicion is that it's a shrine that wasn't actually in Petra itself, that it's somewhere that is remoter, that is harder to get to.
Two things. First of all, even if it's not Petra, we can almost be 100% sure that it was not Mecca, right? And also... almost.
Well, let's answer that first.
Okay, but I want to add on to that because what do you think about the main evidence now, which is that all the mosques within the first 100 years after the alleged death of Muhammad, their qiblas are pointing with a high degree of accuracy to Petra instead of Mecca? Like, isn't that like a almost definite proof?
I think it's strong proof that it was in the region of Nabatea or of that kind of area. Right. I don't think it's proof that it was pointing specifically at Petra, but I do think that, and the key evidence above all else is that the essence of it is an Abrahamic religion. So when we talk about Islam being an Abrahamic religion, think what that means. The foundation of it is the idea that it all comes from Abraham. Abraham is the first monotheist. He is the father of Ishmael. We know where Abraham was associated with in the lifetime of Muhammad, and it was not Mecca, or at least it wasn't the Mecca that we now have. There is no tradition that associates him with the Hijaz at all. He's absolutely associated with this region beyond the Holy Land. That's what you would expect. And the fact that the Qibla seemed to point in that direction seems to me to substantiate that rather than to be clinching proof. Because you could say, and I know that people have, that this is an early period. Perhaps the geometry isn't absolutely being worked out or whatever. I mean, I don't know. But the really clinching proof to me is the fact that we know where the Abrahamic traditions are associated with. We know the kind of communities that are being described in the Quran. Everything seems to point towards somewhere in the vicinity of between the Dead Sea and Petra, and that seems to me the region.
Right, but if the geometry was the issue, how is it that all these different qiblas in many different cities are so accurately pointed? Like, it seems like a systematic error that is giving them the same exact error to the same exact city. Like the accuracy is too much for this to
Google,
be
If you use Google Maps, then not Google Maps, Google Earth, then it's actually pretty stunning.
It's actually more accurate than the qiblas later that point to Mecca. The qiblas the mosques that were built later that point to Mecca, they have less degree of accuracy than the ones that were built earlier that point to Petra.
Well, I'm not a geometer nor a geographer, so I haven't done the calculations. But I would suspect that the intersection isn't so conclusively on Petra that it absolutely proves it. I'm aware that the qiblas point to that region, so I think it's likelier to be somewhere in that region. The whole account of Mecca as a great city, which full of merchant cities, the kind of thing that you get in Dune, is essentially a kind of it's a Marxist invention, but the temptation is to try and this idea that that Islam is to be explained as a kind of anti-capitalist rising. I mean, it was essentially invented in the 70s. I don't think that that's the background at all. I think the background is a shrine with an agricultural community around it. Right. And there are plenty of places in the near vicinity of Petra that would serve that. But somewhere, if it's going to be wiped out completely, the memory of it, I think it has to be somewhere that was kind of distinctive to a particular community, but didn't have a high profile. And if you look in the Quran, there are lots of accounts that seem to describe Mecca. I mean, a Freudian slip there, that seem to describe Petra or the Byzantine cities that lay out in the Negev. Yeah.
So
essentially, it seems to me that the Quran is the record of people who are beyond the urban and who have a suspicion of the urban, and Petra would be included in that. I mean, I think you're right. I think that Petra is probably it kind of serves what Babylon serves, Rastafarians. It's the model of what God will overthrow and God has overthrown. It's the nearest metropolis, but I don't think that they're based in Petra itself. I don't think Petra was the same.
So are you sure that it was? We could say with almost 100% sure that it was not Mecca. Can we say that?
I think that. Yeah. Well, I think I wouldn't say 100%, but I think the balance of probability is very, very strong that it isn't. I mean, I've never heard any convincing account, any convincing explanation of how you deal with the stuff that Patricia Crone raised about the olives, the vines, the cattle. It doesn't correspond to what we know were the agricultural limits of the Hijaz.
Right. Yeah. So, Tom, you mentioned Patricia Crone again and her book Hagarism, which was, I guess it changed the field in a lot of ways, but it was also very controversial. And I think that the authors also retracted parts of it. Maybe you could explain that as well. But what is, and you've done the same thing. You've pointed questioned the where Mecca originally was. This was a very difficult thing for her to take on. And for you to take on as well, and you received a lot of backlash. So I just want to kind of talk about that and touch on it. Is this? It seems obviously much more controversial and much more difficult to do this kind of scholarship compared to when you're studying Christianity.
It was certainly more difficult than studying the Roman Republic, which nobody really nobody
put it anywhere.
Yeah. But it was difficult for two reasons. I'm just going to get a quote from Patricia Crone's great rival Fred Donner, who they were always kind of biting chunks out of each other. But by the time Patricia Crone died, basically they'd arrived, it seemed to me, at pretty much the same idea, because Patricia was Hagarism was a kind of total trashing of the Islamic tradition. And Fred Donner's history of the Arab invasions was highly reliant on the received Islamic tradition. Now they're essentially at the same place, and where they are is saying, look, the only way that we can judge this is by putting emergent Islam in the context of late antiquity. And because they spent so long slagging each other off, they didn't entirely recognize it. It was the narcissism of small differences. But basically, they arrived at the same place. So I just want to read something that Fred Donner wrote, which sums up why it's so difficult to write about this for a general audience. And if you're doing what I'm doing, which is to write particularly a narrative history. So you just hold on a minute. I'm just going to divest myself of my headphones.
Okay. Ali, I really want to get into the historicity of Muhammad at some point, if you give me the chance to ask a question.
Okay, so this is from a book called The Quran and its Historical Context. And Donner wrote the opening chapter, The Quran in Recent Scholarship, and the the opening paragraph sets out why this is such a nightmare to write. If you imagine, as I did, you're trying to write a narrative history from the age of Justinian in the early 6th century through to the founding of Baghdad, and you've got to deal with the lifetime of Muhammad and the emergence of Islam. So this is what Donner wrote. Quranic studies as a field of academic research appears today to be in a state of disarray. Those of us who study Islam's origins have to admit collectively that we simply do not know some very basic things about the Quran, things so basic that the knowledge of them is usually taken for granted by scholars dealing with other texts. They include such questions as, how did the Quran originate? Where did it come from? And when did it first appear? How was it first written? In what kind of language is it written? What form did it first take? Who constituted its first audience? How was it transmitted from one generation to another, especially in its early years? When, how, and by whom was it codified? Those familiar with the Quran and its scholarship on it will know that to ask even one of these questions immediately plunges us into realms of grave uncertainty and has the potential, and this is a magnificent understatement, has the potential to spark intense debate. So in other words, that's Fred Donner, one of the great scholars of the Quran, who's devoted his life to the study of it and to its context in early Islam, is basically saying we don't know. We don't even know what language it was originally written in. We don't know where it was written, when it was written, who by, who its audience were. And that essentially is the state of play. And so anyone who says, I definitely know what happened, it's a statement of faith. And of course, that for Muslims is exactly what it is. If you accept that it comes from God, then everything else follows from that. But if you don't, you have to acknowledge that the beginnings of this empire, this formative civilization, we don't know where its foundational text came from. Right. There's so much we don't know about it. And so if you're writing a narrative history, that's an absolute nightmare. And so when I came to write In the Shadow of the Sword, I don't try and I don't want to force the academic debate down the general reader's throat, because that's, it's kind of tough. People don't necessarily want to. But with this, I had no choice, because there is ultimately no answer. And if I was going to explain what I think, I had to give my reasons for that. And I think that that writing a narrative history in that way was an excellent discipline, and it's one that many academics don't have to put themselves through. And when they do, then there are all kinds of problems. So you will still get very, very reputable scholars who will be writing about the origins of Islam and will say, Muhammad received revelations from an angel. And you go, what the fuck? What? Sorry? Say that again? It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable for a non-Muslim scholar who's not doing apologetics to think that the Quran came from an angel. You have to provide an explanation that does not derive from the supernatural. And it's incumbent on anyone who wants to explain the origins of Islam to explain where the Quran comes from. Right. And the big thing that I felt in the 4 years that I spent kind of grappling, trying to in this bog that is early Islamic studies, is that too many scholars are scared of, are nervous of doing that, and I don't think it's because they're scared of being, killed or anything like that. I think it's just that the risk of the entire foundations of their discipline collapsing are too great. Because if you accept all those questions that Donna set out, that we simply don't know the answers to that, then it becomes incredibly difficult, really, to write anything in any certainty about the Quran at all.
Can we write about
beyond? We
can write about what we don't know. That's already fascinating.
We can write about you can write about what you don't know,
right?
And you can write about what you think that you can, what we can know, what few shards.
Right.
But the darkness is pretty impenetrable, and I think there's a nervousness on the part of many scholars to admit that, because if they do, well, what do you write about? You could, Donna set that out in his paragraph, and he hasn't really got much else to write after that.
Right. Talking about what we don't know and the darkness, what about Muhammad himself? Because you mentioned the letter, they mentioned a prophet of the Saracens at 634, I think you mentioned, 2 years after they alleged he was supposed to be dead already by then, but they don't mention Muhammad. They don't mention it's Abdul Malik
by name.
It's Malik that mentions Muhammad on coins and on the Dome of the Rock for the first time. And on coins also, it was the first coins that mentioned Muhammad were mentioned in were in Persia at that time, right?
That's right.
There was no mention.
Sabaya.
So it's very. How do we even know Muhammad was real, given that it seems like Muslims have forgotten that their prophet is Muhammad until, is it possible that Malik invented Islam altogether, like Muhammad being the prophet? The Shahadat was not never seen until he put it on the Dome of the Rock and on the coins before him. Isn't maybe he claimed to be like Muhammad? Maybe he is the founder of Islam. Is that possible?
I think he is the founder of Islam.
Okay,
but I also think that Muhammad existed, and that Muhammad was associated right from the beginning with the Quran. I think that elements within the Quran are much older than Muhammad, so I don't think that Muhammad was the author of it all. As Donna set out, the process by which the Quran comes to take on the form that it has now, the process by which it comes to form a coherent whole, the process by which it comes to be associated with a single prophetic voice is very, very difficult to work out.
Right.
But I think that once it becomes established as a kind of a repository of divinely authored scripture, I think that it is associated from the beginning with a prophet. And I think it makes sense to assume that if it wasn't Muhammad, then it was someone else called Muhammad. Let's put it like that.
But we don't know his name was Muhammad.
Well, we do, because we have a Christian bishop writing a couple of decades after his death who refers to Muhammad as a prophet of the Saracens.
Yeah, but
refers
not Muhammad.
to him as.
But he doesn't refer to him as Muhammad.
No, he did. He did.
Yes, he mentions Muhammad by name.
Separate. No.
Oh,
he mentions Muhammad by name.
What year is this?
And tellingly, he describes Muhammad as a kind of Abrahamic figure,
right.
and as basically forming an alliance with the Jews.
What year is
that's
this?
the kind of thing that bishops are particularly antsy about.
Right.
But it does seem to correspond to the swirl of what we know initially. So I think that what I suspect happens is that you have Arab kingdoms that are settled along the borders of Roman and Persian provinces, and they've been employed as kind of mercenary kingdoms. When the Roman and Persian power kind of collapses in the Great War between them, these kingdoms are left to kind of go by on their own. They're not getting the gold subsidies that they were previously getting.
Right.
They're further within the hinterland, there are other Arab leaders who are looking at the chaos that's going on and saying, well, this is the will of God. So we know that there are kind of various prophets that are operating within Arabia at the time when Muhammad is operating. It seems to me that Muhammad becomes the leader of a particular group of Arabs. I think that the hijrah to Yathrib, what becomes Medina, the city of the Prophet, I think that's authentic. Because again, there are reference to this quite early in Christian texts. Medina seems to have been the capital from which the invasions were launched. Again, we know that's stated quite early on. The focus is on the Holy Land, but what happens? It's not really the Romans who are the focus of the attack. It's the Arabs who are allied to the Romans. And the closest parallel perhaps might be with what happens to the French at Dien Bien Phu after the Second World War, because the French have lost the French have been defeated. Who the Japanese take over, the French then move back in, or the Dutch in Indonesia. They have no real authority, and basically power just crumbles away from them. And I think that's the state that the Romans are in. I think that essentially there's a kind of turf war between the settled Arab kingdoms and this kind of upstart group of Arabs out in the Negev or in the region of Petra that move in. They win. Everything else collapses. They take over the Persian Empire as well. Everyone's going, whoa, blimey, look at this. Fuck, we've conquered. Who'd have thought this? Right. And so they have to start working out why and how this has happened. There are various experiments. Right. I think Umar is clearly historical. He is associated with the monastic tradition in the early sources. He's a kind of ascetic in that kind of monastic tradition. Right. He seems to embody an idea of a holy man from the desert who goes out into the desert to fight with devils. He's a literal soldier of God who then militarizes that, literalizes that, and turns it against his enemies in the Persian and the Roman worlds. Right. I think that Muawiyah, the first great Umayyad caliph, I think he thinks, well, he adopts the Theodoric approach. He's going to be a kind of heretical Christian. And then I think with Abdul Malik, he looks back to the prophet, because his rival has begun this. Because if you can say, well, we've got a prophet of God, right, then basically anything that you attribute to him, brilliant, Bob's your uncle. It absolutely demonstrates that you are the legitimate ruler of the world. And I think Abdul Malik recognizes the potency of this, and it kind of bigging up Muhammad as the prophet of God, because clearly by this point people were starting to forget about Muhammad. I think he kind of, in the way that medieval kings might kind of decide, well, I'm going to have this guy as a saint and build up his cult. In exactly the same way, Abdul Malik builds up the cult of Muhammad. And It serves two purposes. The first is that it puts the Romans in their place, because, it cuts the umbilical cord with Christianity. Christian Constantinople is now put in the shade. Christianity is a superseded covenant. It's, the Christians are binned. They've been left on the trash heap of history. Right. Now, Abdul Malik has this, this seal of the prophets, the last of the prophets. But the second thing it does is to basically legitimize anything that Abdul Malik wants to do, because he can say, well, why am I doing this? Well, there's this prophet, and I'm the deputy of God, so I can do what I like.
Oh,
and
he's using religion for political purposes.
Yeah, so saying, well, yes, but we mustn't impose a kind of Christian idea of church and state.
Yeah,
right. That would be anachronistic. I'm sure Abdul Malik devoutly believes that he is the deputy of God, and that basically he's on a par with Muhammad. But by putting Muhammad's name on the Dome of the Rock, by putting the Dome of the Rock on the site of the Jewish temple, by making its contours put the Church of the Sepulchre in its place, what he's doing is saying, I am the lord of an empire that has been raised by a God who has weighed the Jews and the Christians and found them wanting. My mandate is now superior. And I, as the deputy of God, I am closer to God than the emperor in Rome. The emperor in Constantinople. So basically, he's constructing this kind of nascent faith in the way that Paul did in his letters. But also, like Constantine, he's fashioning an empire, a mandate for his imperial rule that derives directly from God. And the God of Islam is of an order of power considerably greater than the Jewish or the Christian God, because the Jewish God binds himself with a covenant. That's the whole point. The Christian God gets nailed to a cross and tortured to death. I mean, you're not going to have that. The Muslim God is absolutely terrifyingly omnipotent. He can do anything he likes. He can wipe out the world. He can make humans worship idols if he wants to. There is nothing that is right or wrong, except that this God says what is right or wrong. And if you're the king, if you're the lord, if you're the caliph of this emergent empire, then that's a brilliant sanction. You can do anything you like with it.
Just to tie it in with what you said before, Abdul Malik uses the name Muhammad for legitimacy, but then this name Muhammad is used as a weapon against the caliphs as well by the scholars to take away legitimacy away from the caliphs towards the scholars, right? Regarding the name of Muhammad, you mentioned, so the 634 letter didn't mention Muhammad by name, just the prophet of the Saracens, but there was another letter you said by somebody else.
It's a bishop called Ceballos.
Was that during Abdul Malik's time or before Abdul Malik's time?
Before.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Like
it was
2
already
decades after.
2 decades after Muhammad. Okay. And Abdul Malik stole this idea of using Muhammad's name as legitimacy from his rival, which was what was it? Zubayr? Zubayr, yeah. Okay. Ali, we need to get into the patron questions.
We will. I just want to get back to, based on one thing, just last question before we get to our patron questions, I know we talked about this before with the Constitution of Medina, whether it's accurate, because I know that does mention a lot of names of that. What is the authenticity of that document? Because that is something that is brought up by a lot of apologetics, including Islamic scholars. The Constitution of Yathrib or Medina.
Well, the Constitution of Medina, so called, did not exist as a constitution. It's a bit like. If say you have a medieval castle with recognizably Roman carvings on it, you would be able to work out that the stonemasons had used fragments from a Roman building, and the original context in which these stones existed had been completely obliterated. That essentially is what the Constitution of Medina is. It's trace elements of an order that scholars know basically to be much older than everything else in the received inheritance of Islamic traditions, because it doesn't tie in with what we know later. So that's essentially what it is, and what it points towards is that this is a community. And that it's a community in which Jews essentially have a kind of associated status, and it's that provides the foundation for Fred Donner's understanding of a community of believers in which Jews and Christians and whatever we want to call, Ishmaelites, Mujaroon, whatever you want to call them,
not Muslims.
Not Muslims. That these are all people with a shared sense of purpose. I mean, it's a useful clue for what's going on, and it seems to correspond to what Ceballos describes as well. So it insofar as we can be sure that this is what the original community was like, that seems to point to what we have.
Does it mention Muhammad by name?
No,
can't remember. It's been 4 years.
Okay. We'll look that up and we'll add to it.
Yeah, okay. So let's go to Patreon questions. I have a million other questions that I'm not going to be able to ask because of the time.
Yeah, same here.
but we need to ask the patrons. Okay, good.
Okay. So let's do the very first one comes from Hazem, and I guess so. He's saying, why did you change your position on Christianity? Now, I don't know the background about this, but have you changed your position on Christianity recently?
Oh, yes. I've decided that morally and ethically and in my assumptions, I am not in any way descended from the classical Greeks or Romans, which is what I'd always thought. And I've realized that I'm just completely shot through with Christian and specifically Protestant assumptions. And I used this analogy earlier, but essentially it's like asbestos dust. That even if you pull a building with asbestos down, the dust still lingers and you still breathe it in. So I think that we were just talking about church and state. The idea of church and state, the idea of there being something called a religion. A religion is a word that is freighted with all kinds of Christian assumptions. So the moment you talk about something called Islam, and you say Islam is a religion, the sense of there being something called Islam is a Christian categorization. And the idea of a religion as something that is separate from the rest of society, likewise, is a category that's entirely bred of Christian assumptions. So in a sense, to use English as a native speaker, you're absorbing Christian assumptions, even often without realizing it. And it's taken me kind of a long process to realize just how Christian my assumptions are. So that's
But the Quran refers to a religion, the deen.
Yeah, but deen it's an inadequate translation. I mean, in Latin, there's a word religio, which you'd think you just bung an N on the word, but it's not the same thing at all. A deen is I mean, the essence of what Muslims believe is that God has revealed a total way of living. You shouldn't be able to kind of fragment off something called religion and park it in a lay-by, and everything else happens in a kind of in existence where this religion has no impact. That's what's required of Muslims. It's what's required of Jews. It's what's required of Christians. But it's an assumption that's bred of Christianity. It's bred of the idea that there's a dimension of the sacred and a dimension of the saeculum. And the saeculum is a Latin word that means the limit of human memory. And that becomes to mean the secular. So wherever you have the idea that there's church and state, that the religious and the secular, those are the trace elements of Christian assumptions. And the difficulty that Muslims face is that particularly in the West, is that they live in a world that is so saturated in these assumptions that they may not even realize that they're assumptions. And certainly the people who assume that to be secular is to be neutral between religion don't understand that. To be secular is not remotely to be neutral. To be secular is essentially to be the heir of Christian assumptions. So there's then an enormous pressure on Jews and Muslims to adapt to that. And I think that many of the tensions that exist between secular society and Islam reflect that, because essentially Muslims have two choices. They can either adapt to it, become kind of liberal, reconfigure Islam as a religion in the Christian sense, or they can resist it and say, no, we belong to, our deen, we belong to an ummah, but that then places them in direct tension with the assumptions of secular society. So it's a real problem.
But Islam is a byproduct of Christianity and a response to it, by people like Abdul Malik. So why wouldn't the idea of religion also transfer from Christianity to Islam?
Because I don't think that because the word religion doesn't exist in early Christianity either. It's really a Protestant word. A religio in Latin means a binding. And it's what binds you as a mortal to the gods. So it could be a sacrifice, it could be a feast day, it could be a priesthood, something like that. When the Roman Empire becomes Christian, there is only one religio. There is only one way of binding yourself to God. And the religiones are those who particularly bind themselves to God. So monks, nuns, hermits, friars, that kind of thing. When you have the Reformation, the assumption in the Reformation is that everyone can be religiones. Religio is not just for monks; it's for everyone. So everyone has a religion, and this then generates a kind of tension. On the one hand, religion is what everyone should have. So in the English Civil War, it's both Charles I and the parliamentarians are fighting over what religion should be in England, but at the same time, religion is something that is private. It's what you privately feel God should be. And because of the religious civil wars in the 17th century, it's the second one that wins out. The Protestant countries, so Germany, England, America, the idea that religion is something that is private to you, that can be abstracted from the rest of society, absolutely beds down. And that's then a concept that the British in particular, with export to the rest of the world. So they obviously take it to India. It's established, its root beds down in America. It's forced at the point of a gun on the Ottomans. And it's an understanding of the world, the idea that, freedom of religion, the idea that it's kind of like a supermarket, that everyone has the right to pick what religion they want. This is a really, really culturally distinctive way of seeing the world. And the fact that so many people do now across the world is a tribute to the cultural influence of Anglo-America.
Yeah, this is actually something that Khomeini, by the way, Armin, used to talk about. This is one of the reasons that he didn't like, he used to talk about how theocracy is ingrained in Islam, and these are all sort of Protestant concepts of, being able to interpret it the way you want. But anyway, so I'll continue. And at this point, because you talked about all this, I also want to mention that you have a new book that's coming out in the fall. Yeah. And it's called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. That's the UK title, and then the US title, subtitle was Dominion, the Christian Revolution?
How the Christian Revolution reshaped the world.
Okay. So and you're going to be talking about this, and you mentioned to me, which I find fascinating, that Islam has largely been Protestantized in the last 1 or 2 centuries. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because up until really when Napoleon turns up in Egypt, Islam doesn't have to engage with any other way of seeing the world. It's it's been so culturally hegemonic for so long. It's always been the most powerful. It's always been the richest. It's been the most culturally sophisticated region of the world for so long that it doesn't cross its mind that it has to have anything to do with Franks, these kind of smelly people who hover on the margins of the Islamic world. And then Napoleon turns up, and it's kind of seismic shock. And the scale. I mean, an example of what happens, of how Islam comes to be Protestantized, is the process by which the Ottomans are forced to give up on the slave trade. Because what happens is that the British have decided that slavery is illegitimate, that it's an offense to God. And the reason, why have they decided this? I mean, Christians have had slaves. I mean, the British were massive slave exporters. The reason that they've decided this is that their understanding of what's right and wrong reflects the notion that the Holy Spirit, is writing law on the heart. So that to know what's right and wrong, you have to look into your heart, and that will then tell you what's right and wrong. Yeah. When the British go to various Muslim potentates along the line of the Mediterranean and say, look, you've got to stop the slave trade, these Muslim rulers turn around and say, you've got to be joking. Why the hell should we? Slavery is absolutely fine. We've always had slaves. It's in the Quran. It's in the Sunnah. Muhammad had slaves. Why should we give them up? And the British say, because it's wrong. And they say, well, how do you know it's wrong? And the British say, we just know it. We've got it in the heart. The Spirit tells us that it's wrong. And it's an offence against human rights, which is a concept that international law, Catholic and Protestant lawyers have come up to try and basically bridge the divide between them. This means nothing to Muslims at all at the time. I mean, this is a holy Christian tradition. But the British basically make it a condition of supporting the Ottomans in the Crimean War, that they have to abolish the jizya, so the discriminatory taxes imposed on Jews and Christians, and they have to start stopping the slave trade. So the Sultan regretfully does this. And then he has to explain why this has happened. I mean, he can't say, well, we're doing it because, an infidel power is telling us to do it. So Muslim scholars start to say, well, this is what it was always in Islam. It was always inherent within Islam. The Prophet may have had slaves, but basically he was interested. He only bought them so he could then free them. And there's a kind of, it may say that it's okay to have slaves, but the real meaning of Islam is that you shouldn't. Yeah. This is a Protestant way of understanding law. It's exactly what Protestants are doing with the Bible. They're saying, okay, it may say this in the Bible, but actually, I know the Spirit has illumined my heart. I'm a Quaker. I'm an evangelical. I know that this is wrong. And so Muslims start to do this as well. And right the way up to now, Muslims who say Islam is compatible with Western liberal secular democracy. It is, to the degree to which it's been secularized, to which it's been Christianized, to which it's been Protestantized.
So the Reformation term is an apt analog in some ways, where there's an attempted Reformation.
Don't start that. Okay,
we're not going to start.
That's another 2-hour episode. But listen, can we finish because we're out of time? So can we just finish all the questions?
Yeah, let's do that.
To these ones, feel free to just give really quick answers because we
sure.
don't want to.
Okay.
Yeah. Go. Serena.
So the thing is, I've curated these. So a lot of these are about things that we already covered, like the Petra thing and all of that. But I'm going to read one from Renzo, and Renzo's saying, "Could you say that modern Western civilization followed a pattern like Islam, a system of empires created in a time of plague, which was then legitimized by a mythological story?"
I think every empire mythologizes itself, and an empire cannot survive without a sense of self-justification. That is entirely clear. One of the ways in which the Western empires are interesting is that basically they undermined their own rationale. So there is no anti-imperialist like the Western anti-imperialist. And of course, if you conquer people, you need to essentially ascribe a kind of justification for your rule. That's what the Arab Empire did. It's what the Romans did. It's what Persians did, and it's what the Western empires tried to do. Essentially, the West lost its self-confidence.
Okay.
That last question over there, Farzam. What does
Farzam, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
I was actually going to. There are two questions actually.
Okay.
The first one is it possible about the accounts about Muhammad, which point out to an Arab prophet conquering land, is actually pointing to the acting the Caliph at the time, possibly Omar or someone else, or were they most likely?
I'm not sure which prophecies those are.
Wait, so can you ask your question again? Which I think
is it possible about the accounts about Muhammad which point to an Arab?
Right.
So maybe he says maybe the stories that were mentioned about Muhammad was actually about something that Omar did instead, and maybe he was completely made up.
Possibly. I mean, I think that the traditional account of Muhammad, as they come to be enshrined, decades later, they must preserve authentic traditions, and some of those traditions may well derive from Umar. I mean, Umar, the traditions ascribed with Umar, really do seem genuinely late antique. So I would put quite a lot of credence on their authenticity. I think that probably does reflect the kind of person that Umar was. And so where Muhammad is described as an ascetic, that may well derive from Umar.
Interesting.
Okay. So the last question is also from Farzam. What does the current historical evidence tell us about the claim that the Quran has not been changed since the time it was revealed to Muhammad?
I think that, like any text, it's clear that the Quran has evolved. There've been obviously many variant traditions. The idea that the Quran has only one text is really a product of, when was it, 1922, the Cairo edition, 1923, can't remember. So I mean, even within the fabric of Muslim tradition, there's absolutely acknowledged that there are variant traditions. I think it's clearly evolved. However, that said, I do also think that it's remained astonishingly stable, and you only have to compare it with the kind of the relativism of the hadiths.
Right.
I mean, basically, they'll chuck any old thing into that. Right. Whereas with the Quran, there's all kinds of stuff within it that clearly Muslims writing in, say, the 8th or 9th century had no idea what it meant. So. And that in turn plays a crucial part in the construction of Muhammad's biography, because things are drawn from the Quran there are things in the Quran that seem to make no sense. So people assume, well, this must be an episode from Muhammad's life or something. And the parallel that I always draw is with Shakespeare, that Shakespeare's plays are so significant in English and American culture that we want to know more about him. We have the plays, but we don't know very much about Shakespeare. So people go through the plays and the sonnets and they kind of say, oh, well, he fell in love with a dark lady and he seems not to have got on with his uncle. And so they construct whole stories that are extrapolated from Shakespeare's texts and weave them into supposedly Shakespeare's life. I think the same process happens with the Quran. That he hides in a cave. Fuck, Muhammad must have hidden in a cave. Or he seems very concerned about orphans. God, Muhammad must have been an orphan. And it's a kind of way of extracting stuff from the Quran to try and explain it. But it basically the Quran is like it's like an enormous rock face of sediment with strange fossils in it, not all of which can readily be explained. And a lot of the exegetical tradition in Islam is about trying to understand stuff that has been forgotten. Now, why would you preserve stuff that you've forgotten? Well, because you think it's sacred.
Yeah.
So I think that of course it's changed, but I think that Muslims are right to say it's been astonishingly stable. Right. So basically, stable enough to impress secular scholars of its stability, but not stable enough for the Muslim scholars to be comfortable with it because they want absolute stability, because they don't want any changes. So the changes have been minor enough for the secular scholars to be impressed with how much of it is preserved. But the fact that it was changed even a little bit is problematic for Muslims.
I guess so.
Right.
I guess so. I think that not in any way an expert on traditions of Quranic interpretation in the golden age of Islamic civilization, but from what I do know, there's an incredible subtlety and sophistication about it. I mean, there isn't this sense that the text has to be absolutely stable and this therefore proves that it's the word of God, because that's a kind of understanding that betrays a distinctively 19th century Christian understanding. Because what happened again, this is how Islam's been Christianized, is that in the 19th century, scholars, particularly in Germany, started subjecting the Bible to all kinds of textual criticism and trying to work out how the text might have evolved. Was it a compilation of different texts? Was it stitched together? Are the claims of the Gospels correct? Why are the synoptic Gospels different from John's Gospel? I mean, all this kind of stuff. And this was a tradition that Muslim scholars seized on because it became an opportunity for them to prove that the Bible had indeed been tampered with, as they'd always said, and changed. But of course, the risk with that is that these approaches and analyses can be applied to the Quran as well. And it's noticeable that you get Quranic scholars in Saudi Arabia who are versed in the kind of 19th century biblical scholarship. But the moment that you apply that to the Quran, they'll go, no,
of course.
So it's become a lot more kind of brittle. That they're very, very nervous about anything that might suggest that scholars could do to the Quran what scholars have done to the Bible. There's a brilliant edition that's come out of the Quran, edited by Gabriel Said Reynolds, called, I think, The Bible and the Quran, which essentially goes through the Quran and draws out all the textual echoes, all the allusions, all the mentions of the Bible, and demonstrates conclusively, to my mind, that the Quran is a text that is absolutely
Where can we find
shot
this?
through with Amazon, I think. I mean, it's
shot through with what? Sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted you. That was perfect.
With all kinds of allusions and echoes and reworkings of the biblical tradition.
And what was the name of the book again?
I think. Hold on, I've just got it up here. Let me go and check. Hold on.
This is so good. This seems like a treasure trove.
I know.
Wait, let me see.
It's called The Quran and the Bible, and it's edited by Gabriel Said Reynolds.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
Gabriel Said Reynolds. Okay.
And it's doing what any critical work of a work of ancient literature should do, which is to say, well, where are these traditions coming from? What are the echoes? Of course, in Islamic scripture tradition, you wouldn't do that because it comes from God. So why would you bother?
This is why Yemen's government stopped giving access to the Qurans to the Western scholars to come look at it. I mean, they stopped allowing it because it was so problematic, right?
Yeah. But I mean, so what this does is the equivalent of looking at the Aeneid, and saying, well, what are the traditions that it's drawing off from Homer and from Greek poetry? It's that kind of level.
Right. And you got death threats for what you do, didn't you?
Particularly for the film, I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of the book. I mean, people who read books are far too sensible to issue death threats. but
right.
people who watch, the problem with the film was that Channel 4, the British TV company that commissioned it and broadcast it, were quite. They were quite nervous, and so they didn't actually say what the film was about. They just said it's a film about Muhammad and Islam. So lots of Muslims watched it thinking that it was going to be very, a kind of traditional account, and were rather startled when I popped up and started asking if Mecca was actually in Jordan.
Happens.
And so everyone went apeshit for a month or two.
Oh my God.
Everything good now, though? You're safe?
Secure? Yeah, everything's fine now. Yeah.
Okay.
Until your new book comes out, where people can find. What was that again?
Yeah.
Dominion is coming out in September in Britain and October in America.
Yeah, Dominion over.
Yeah, it's called Dominion: The Making of the Western Mind.
Okay, go check that. I'm gonna.
And we would love to, because I know that we got into this, and I want to be just really mindful of your time. I know we're a few minutes over, but I would love to have you come and talk more about that. I think the idea of Islam being Protestantized in the last century, it hit home for me, and it would actually, to Armin's, in Armin, we talk about Islamic reform a lot versus apostasy, and I think it would be just fascinating just to talk about that angle, and also
I hope it is. I mean, it's a book that absolutely bears the imprint of what I've been writing about Islam, and just realizing how of course there are all kinds of similarities. But the kind of assumption in liberal Western society that Islam is, of course, compatible with Western liberalism, although it seems tolerant, actually isn't remotely tolerant, because it's a form of Christian imperialism. It's assuming that Islam can be absorbed within the big tent of post-Christian universalism, and Islam is a civilization as rich and deep and sophisticated and complex as Christian civilization, and it can't just be absorbed like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of the Shadi Hamid Islamic exceptionalism.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant book. I think and I think he's right. I think he's, I think that Islam has been substantially Protestantized, but there's a kickback, and that's kind of that's the tension in the Muslim world at the moment. Really, is how Protestant do you want to be?
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. I've learned a tremendous amount. The way I have said this before, I told you as well that I absolutely love the way you write. So you're one of my favorite authors. In the Shadow of My
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite books. I've read it several times, and I refer to it a lot as well. Yeah, and so today it seems like when you narrated it, it's completely riveting. You speak just as well as you write. So thank you for this time, and I really appreciate it.
Please come back again to our show.
I'd be honored anytime.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you to all of our patrons. Super appreciated. Renzo, Hazem, Aaron. I can't name all of you right now because we're out of time. But thank you. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. All right, let me stop streaming. Thank you, everybody. Love you all in the live chat. Also, actually, let me also say Farzam, thank you so much as well. Aaron, Halima, Mike also. Thank you guys in the live chat. Oh, Cecil, All right. Sorry if I missed Lorenzo. You already mentioned. Sorry if I missed anybody. It wasn't on purpose.
The secular jihadists have been made possible thanks to the Illuminati and the covert support of Israel and the CIA. That's what we have been told, but we haven't received our checks yet. If you like what we do, please support us. Share the podcast with your friends. Write and tweet us with topic and guest suggestions. Or head over to secularjihadist.com and give $1 or more for exclusive access to live video. Have your questions read and answered on the air, and more. Till next time, may the flying spaghetti monster be with you.